There we go. Okay, great. Awesome. So compliance, why compliance? Why are we doing this? Libraries in New York State must comply with several regulations and requirements. NCLS annually conducts our compliance continuing education to help libraries identify and meet these requirements. This is Dawn and I's second year focusing on this, and we're doing it right in the fall. I think next year for our third year, we might do some little topics throughout the year, change it up a little bit, but we're going to make compliance a bigger focus every single year. So why, again, do we do this? This focus on compliance provides confidence in the operation of the library. Even if you're doing everything right, at least you know that you're doing everything right. It reduces confusion and it reduces exposure to risks. While this class doesn't contain every compliance issue, what we cover and what we highlight are some of the most important, frequently asked, most missed, and most risky issues. We want to try to mitigate some of that potential risk from not being in compliance, right? Risk, well, of course, the risk involved depends on the compliance issue. And whilst many of the requirements do come from state agencies, right? Whether it be New York State's open meetings law or the Division of Library Development, sometimes issues with requirements, can come from members of your community, right? So if you're not in compliance with something with open meetings law, for instance, sometimes it's a contentious, oftentimes, especially across the state, we see that a lot of the issue with that ends up coming from a member of the community, not necessarily, top down, because, they want to hold you accountable, right? So if you're not in compliance with something that we covered today, it's definitely going to be okay. We're just going to simply make the change as soon as the board is able to and move forward. And Celeste is obviously here to help. If you've missed a requirement, consider a policy or procedural adjustment to ensure that you stay in compliance in the future, right? So for instance, if you're not having all your documents for your board meetings 24 hours in advance, and I'll talk about this, 24 hours in advance of the actual board meeting, maybe consider some little procedural change so that that is never missed again, right? Okay, so the first topic that we're going to start with is minimum standards, and I'm going to kick it to Dawn to cover these.
Thanks, Matt. So a lot of people say minimum standards. Why? Minimum standards are from the New York State. You can find a lot of them on the New York State Library website. All public and association libraries in New York State must meet the minimum standards. And most of you are familiar with minimum standards. They're on the annual report. You've been answering the questions for years. And these standards are really intended to do three things. Promote the quality of library service in all communities. Empower your libraries to strengthen those community relations and promote public support, and to support a culture of transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. Think of the minimum standards basically as a roadmap to library success. That's kind of how they're set up. And the Board of Regents is the ones who set these standards. The minimum standards, there's 14. A lot of them are brand new and have just been added recently. We are not going to be talking about all of them today, but we will be going over some of these in detail. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of what ones they are. So there's, of course, the written bylaws. So the first six are kind of really clarify more the roles and the responsibilities. So written bylaws. How is your organization, your board going to operate? Long range plan. What is your plans and your goals and the steps that you plan to take along the way? Annual report to the community. What has your library done throughout the year? And how are you looking at that and reporting it to the community so they can see the impact that you're having in the community? Policies. How are you handling your meeting space? How are you handling, what is your internet policy? Those types of things. Written budget. Self-explanatory. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of your programming? That's a requirement. There's a requirement for being open a minimum number of hours. You know, is your library meeting that requirement? Facility has adequate space, seating, power, data, restrooms, all that kind of stuff. So do you have a facility plan? You know, do you keep track of what needs your facility has? And are you meeting the minimum standard requirements? Programming. You know, is your library offering programming? Number 10 is technology and circulation systems. So not just your ILS, but also looking at internet connectivity, your broadband. Do you have technology assistive technology for, you know, people who have, you know, disabilities and things like that? So it's looking at a lot of more than just the ILS. Provides current library information on the library's website. We're going to go into this in detail. There's a lot of new things that have been added to this, including, as Matt was talking about earlier, topics of discussion at board meetings. So we're going to cover this in detail, but are you keeping the information up to date on your website? It's really important that the community is able to see those things, and it is also a requirement. Paid director and minimum educational requirement based on the size of your library and the chartered population to serve. So you will depend on the education requirement for your library. So that's number 12. Annual technology training for library staff. Are you doing a recruit or a day of training for your staff? Some people will do a 1-day staff development day to cover that. Other times people will have online classes offered, or they'll allow their staff to come to NCLS training. You know, are you allowing that time for your directors to be able to go? Are you providing travel expenses and giving them the time off to be able to do training opportunities? Partnerships within the community are very important. It helps to strengthen the library. It also helps to strengthen the impact that you have in the community. So what partnerships have you developed? Are you doing partnerships, you know, with your local Cornell Cooperative Extension, your schools, maybe the YMCA, you know, places like that? So there is a full list description of minimum standards. You can visit that at the New York State Library website. And it'll give you charts on some of those scheduled hours and the minimum education requirements that we talked about. So you really want to visit that. If you're unsure, if you're new, especially, go and visit that, look over the minimum standards, because we are not going, like I said, we're not going to be discussing all of them. We will take you through some of the main ones, but I do want to, you know, have you aware of where you can find the rest. So we talked about the annual report. Each year on the annual report, your board is certifying that your library is meeting those minimum standards. If you are not meeting those standards in that rare event, it can be pretty easy to get back on track. There is a process requiring a variance form and an explanation of why you're not in compliance and what your plans are to get back in compliance. I went to a minimum standards class at NYLA this year at the NYLA conference, and they were really discussing, a lot of people were asking, well, how long do we have to fix this variance? If we're out of compliance, how long do you give? Or is it, you know, do you just keep renewing the variance each year? And they really do not want to do that. That is not something they're looking to do. If you are out of compliance, they're looking for you to address that in a relatively, you know, quick amount of time, depending on the issue. So if it's, you know, an issue that's going to take longer, of course, they're going to grant you a little longer, but they're really looking for you to rectify this, because to be a registered library, you are supposed to meet all of these standards. So keep that in mind, please. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Matt.
Awesome. Okay. So that's a bit about those minimum standards. And now we're going to work into our bylaws. I do want to mention that Dawn and I have created a really perfect, easy little list of every single requirement that we wanted to highlight, and that's going to be on our website. We're going to send you a link to it afterwards. So don't worry about trying to take super detailed notes about all of this. You will have a nice list. Okay, so bylaws. Of course, I think everyone here is familiar with the bylaws, but just to give a little refresher, obviously the board's bylaws define the structure and governing functions of the library board of trustees. Again, as Dawn pointed out, written bylaws are required by that DLD minimum standard number 1. Bylaws should be thorough and clear, so the board has a clear course of action for any situation they encounter. Clarity also helps reduce confusion for new and current board members. Bylaws come in all different shapes and sizes, and it is really your trustees' opportunity to make your own job easier by having very clear bylaws. And consultants are often asked questions by trustees about what to do in a situation, right? What do we do when there's an absence? How do we amend our bylaws? And our response is, what do your bylaws say? Because your own bylaws should be defining your course of action and more. So we'll talk about some required things that are supposed to be in your bylaws that sometimes we are surprised are not in there. And then we'll talk about some really awesome recommendations for language to have in your bylaws. So the very first one is a specified number of board members. A specific number of current board members is required to be stated in your bylaws, and that number cannot change without an amendment to your original charter. So if your original charter said 5 trustees, then you should have 5 trustees now, unless you've had an actual amendment to your charter. And that's a whole process. It requires a little bit of paperwork to the Division of Library Development, okay? It's also a very cheap process, but it does take some months. So several of our libraries have already amended their charters to have a range of trustees. Typically that's 5 to 15. Sometimes it's 5 to 9, but typically it's 5 to 15. And then what that does is it allows you to have a specific number of trustees within that range. And you can change the number of trustees without having to amend your charter with the Division of Library Development each time. However, this is where we find a lot of issues. Some boards have amended their bylaws to say a range, or have amended their charter, right, to have the range 5 to 15. That's great. Then the board votes on a specific number within that range. And your language should say, we can have, not in these exact words, but we can have a range of 5 to 15 trustees and currently have 7 trustees, right? You have to define the actual number in there, and it doesn't change when there are vacancies. So if somebody, even if you've got that range, if you've got a vacancy and somebody leaves, the number of trustees of voting seats doesn't change until the board decides to specifically vote and change that.
Matt, can I say something real quick?
Sure.
Last year on the Compliance Initiative Toolkit, when people were returning them, that was the number one thing that needed to be changed. That was the number one thing that I was seeing, is that they had the range in their bylaws, but they did not have that set specific number of what is my current number of voting trustees.
Yep. And it's so, that is such an important, absolute crucial thing to double check. Also, for any library in here that is interested in amending their bylaws to maybe change their number of trustees to have a range like that, it might make conducting business easier, especially if in some years it's hard to find trustees, or you want to have a bigger board. That way there's more people to delegate work to, right? Absolutely reach out to NCLS, Dawn, your consultant, and we can absolutely help you with that. Okay, this may sound silly, the second one, but it is also very important. You want to have specific trustee terms language in your bylaws, okay? Sometimes our language is a little lacking. Sometimes, so for instance, language that addresses the duration of the term, right? 5 years, etc., starting and ending dates for the term. How many consecutive terms a board member can serve. This is so important and often very confusing. A Board of Regents approved amendment is required to change the term length, again, from 5 to 3 years, right? Because that's something that's stated in your original charter. So the original number of trustees and how long those terms can be, or how many years. When your bylaws, when you want to change something in your bylaws that is stated in your charter, you have to change the charter. You have to amend the charter, right? Okay. One thing that is often very confusing for people, and this is something that we recommend, is considering to add language to address whether a partial term counts towards a full term. I've looked at a lot of bylaws and legislation for like state governments and everything, and they have language to address if a partial term does or doesn't count towards a full term. So for instance, a lot of them say that if you've served more than half of a term, you're serving a partial term, but you've served more than half of a term, 2.5 years, then that does count towards a full term. That's what a lot of the language in those state government bylaws and legislation says. So you absolutely, again, you want to reduce the confusion and make it as easy as possible to, do your job governing the board. Okay. What we now have are a lot of recommended pieces of language for your bylaws that are really helpful. They're so helpful. So, and again, a lot of you may have this. It may also be an opportunity to revisit the language that you currently have anyway, just to see if it's confusing or not. If you've got a new trustee, bounce those bylaws off that trustee and say, hey, is there anything confusing to you? Because then maybe that's an opportunity to amend the language in your bylaws, right? So we'll start with the absences. This language provides the board clarity and flexibility as to what to do when a trustee is absent or unresponsive. Maybe a trustee hasn't shown up to 2 board meetings, 3 board meetings, and there's no excuse. No one's heard from this person. Consultants get asked, what do we do? And then we say, what do your bylaws say? Because you should have language in your bylaws to address what happens. And then that way it provides absolute clarity in words to that person. And it gives the board a course of action. Amendment procedures, language that addresses the process for changing the bylaws, right? So typically there's going to be language in your bylaws about how to amend and change those bylaws. And that may say something like a change for bylaws because it's such an important document. Usually that change is proposed at one meeting, but then voted on at the next meeting. That's a very typical thing to have. Duties and responsibilities of the trustees. This provides the board clarity on the expectations on each position of the board. And so also too, for municipal public libraries, there's been a lot of discussion about not having your treasurer be a voting member of your board, right? But being somebody that's hired. You might want to revisit the language around those duties and make sure that it's clear and that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. Also, filling vacancies. This provides the board clarity as to what to do when the seat becomes vacant, the process to fill that seat, and how to handle, again, partial terms. Okay. Meeting frequency is also very important. Is it 12 times a year, 8 times a year, on the 3rd Monday of each month? For instance, that's just an example. Open meetings law language. I think it's so important to have a statement in your bylaws that says that your board conducts all of its meetings in compliance with New York State open meetings law, right? You're not allowed to go into executive session for any old reason, right? But the open meetings law gives you specific reasons for going into executive session. And so your bylaws should say this is how the board does business. We do business in compliance with New York State open meetings law. You know, and you also advertise those board meetings, which is also outlined in open meetings law, things like that. Okay. Quorum, it is eternally confusing for people. I think it is best to state not just if you've got a range of trustees, what your specific number of trustees is, but then also follow that with what your quorum is. The quorum is the majority of current seats on the board. If you've got a range of 5 to 15 and you have 7 seats, the majority of 7 is 4. That means that for any motion to pass, 4 people, even if 4 people show up to a meeting and 3 are absent, 4 people have to say yes to something. 4 people have to be there to even have the meeting. Okay. Again, you've got new trustees showing up who are not familiar at all with this language and this concept. So that's why it's so important to make that so clear in your bylaws. Dawn?
Hi, Matt. So last year, one thing that I found a lot in the bylaws that I did review is we had libraries that had set the quorum, but when they changed the specific number of voting trustees in the, say they had a range 9 to 15 or 5 to 15, if they went from 7 up to 9, they didn't change the quorum to go along with that. So they still had it as 4, which would be correct for 7 trustees, but you cannot conduct business with 4 trustees if you have now gone up to 9 because your quorum has now jumped up. And now you need 5 people to make it a majority. So just keep in mind that if you're changing the number of trustees that are representing your board, that you also change the quorum to match that.
Awesome. And also too, Dawn and I can help you with any language that you want. Just ask us and we'll be like, okay, here's how I'd word this. Here's some sample language.
Absolutely.
Also, the next thing I'm going to add is a seating chart. It's a tool that's separate from the bylaws. You're not going to put this in your bylaws, but actually, you know, for one of the committees that I do, the Central Library Advisory Committee, on the back of each agenda is also our quote unquote seating chart that basically says, you know, this specific member's name and this is the seat that they're filling. This is their role. And then this is their duty, right? And then also they are serving their 2nd term, which ends this date, right? Dawn is excellent at helping libraries create seating charts, and especially for annual reports, for, you know, every fall, December, when you're trying to figure out what to do, you know, who expires and stuff. Having a seating chart is just like the easiest thing in the world. Okay, and then also having staggered terms. This means that you have the least amount of board members terms expiring at the same time. I actually literally just got a call trying to help a library with this right before this meeting started, where their terms were not staggered. They had 7 trustees who served 5 years each, and in one of the years, 3 of them were gone. You want your terms staggered because it'll also match your original charter, right? In your original charter, those trustees are going to be staggered so that the least amount is expiring at the same time. That also saves the board a headache trying to find so many people in 1 year to serve. You know, have it spread out. Also too, when you've got too much turnover, it can create, you're losing a little bit of that institutional knowledge, right? So this way, when things are staggered, you're losing the least amount of experience and knowledge at a single time.
And Matt, when I help create the seating charts, I do look at what your original charter dates are. And so if you're thinking, if you are not in compliance or I mean, not staggered, and you don't have, you have 5 people out of your 7 going off in 1 year, we can look back at what your original charter says and get you back in compliance and having those staggered terms.
Awesome. Yeah, that is great. Like I said, Dawn is great at those seating charts if you need one. Awesome. And just an overall review, you can optionally have NCLS staff, Dawn or I, or Dawn and I together, review your bylaws to ensure that your library is in compliance. Send them to us anytime. It doesn't have to be because of this class. If you want to make some changes and tweaks, and then 6 months from now, you would like somebody to review your bylaws and just make sure everything looks okay, absolutely send them to us. Okay. For policies, I'm going to kick it back to Dawn. Oh, Dawn, I think you're muted.
Oh, yep, it did remute. Sorry about that. I moved my computer and must have hit it. Policies are the rules and principles really that guide the operation and use of the library. They're required by the education department, and they go along with your public library minimum standards and must be reviewed every 5 years. So this is the one thing that I found last year doing the review, is that a lot of you do have the required policies, but they didn't know if they were reviewed every 5 years. So maybe, coming up with some sort of a procedure so that you can make sure that yours are getting, reviewed every 5 years, maybe, do one this year, one next year, and just kind of stagger them so that it's not too much, because it is a lot. Like bylaws, your policies should be thorough and reduce the guesswork for governing your library. Additionally, they should be applied equally.
Yeah. And I'll just add something here quick. So with your policies, when you're considering language with your policies, you want to consider language that's easy for library staff to apply equally. You don't, and you want to apply them equally. You don't want to make exceptions for, let's say there's a patron behavior policy, right? You want to have a policy that's easy and safe for staff to enforce and apply equally. And you don't want to make all these individual exceptions, because then that can be problematic for the library.
Right. So the required policies are confidentiality of library records policy. A lot of libraries address this in their CERC policies. They don't have a separate confidentiality of library records policy. So either is acceptable, either doing a separate policy or making a statement in your circulation policy stating that you do everything in accordance with the civil practice law 4509. Okay, so please double check to see, which you have, and make sure that you are in compliance with that. The conflict of interest policy, all public and association libraries are subject to the not-for-profit corporation law. We do have a sample of a conflict of interest policy, and there's a link to that there. Matt, do you want to click on that?
Yep. Yes. Very, very easy. Just a nice little one-page trustee.
One page little, and we have a lot of sample policies for our member libraries that we're happy to send. If there is a policy that you do not currently have that is a required one, please reach out to us. We'll send you a sample policy if we have one. And like Matt said, the consultants are more than happy to help work on those. The disaster response policy, that's a board approved disaster response for any natural or man-made disaster that affects your library facilities or your holdings, your staff, library users. We're all pretty familiar with disaster response and pandemic policies, considering everything we've been dealing with for the past few years. So most all of our libraries did have that policy. Internet use policy. What does your internet use policy say? How are people allowed to use your internet? Clearly defining that can save a lot of problems when people come in and are misusing, and not following your internet use policy. So make sure it's clearly stated what you expect. Sexual harassment prevention policy. Every employer is required to adopt this, of course. And they're also, not only do they have to have a sexual harassment prevention policy, but they're also required to have sexual harassment prevention training for all of their staff, trustees. And Matt's going to talk a little bit more about the training end of it. The whistleblower policy, not all libraries are required to have a whistleblower policy. So please, anything that like this that's in red, only applies to certain libraries. So it's for only public and association libraries with 20 or more employees and an annual revenue in excess of $1 million in the fiscal year. Now we have mostly small rural libraries. So when you see that amount, it's kind of like, oh, not me. We don't have very many libraries that have 20 or more employees, if any. So just a thought, or they have the $1 million. So
And
that only applies to those libraries.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'll just mention too, one of the reasons why we list it here is, yes, you might not be, it's required for only those really big libraries, but, and most likely, in the future, as some of our libraries grow and everything big, some of our biggest ones will be required to have that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it wouldn't be a bad idea to also have it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we made sure that it was in here as well, because even though you may not be required, if you read the policy, it's a pretty good policy to have. So anyway, just want to mention that.
Thanks, Matt. So at the time of registration, there are also some policies that are required to be adopted by the state library. And that's for all association and public libraries. And some of those are your collection development policy, meeting space. If you have a meeting room, some places don't have a meeting room or a meeting space, so it wouldn't apply to them. Code of ethics and conduct, what is expected. Personnel policy and financial controls like purchasing and procurement. What does your library require? Do they require you to go out to bid if it's over a certain amount of money that you're spending? Do they have to get three bids? Do they have to get two? Do they go with the lowest bidder? What are your controls on purchasing? And also petty cash. When you're taking in all of that, the fines and printing fees and all that, how are you handling your petty cash? How often is it being taken and gathered and deposited? All of that kind of stuff that you want to lay out in your petty cash policy. So as stated, one of the minimum standards is that those policies be reviewed at least every 5 years. So making sure that you have some sort of rotation, some way of tracking that and making sure that those policies do get updated. Now, some policies are going to be updated more often than that. If it requires a change, let's say you're doing your internet use policy and all this, you change the requirements, you change how many computers are available, what you allow, you expand your broadband, whatever. You want to change that policy, it might get changed more often than the 5 years. That's fine, but make sure that you're reviewing all of them at least every 5 years. So good tip, keep a table of contents, paper, digital, of all your library policies. Personally, I like doing a spreadsheet. I put a spreadsheet in and put in when was the policy written, when was it modified, when was the last update, who did the update. Even I like that initial system if you have multiple people working on it too, because then you can go and you can ask them, about updates. When reviewing a policy, there may or may not be changes to make. If there are no changes, still consider having the board reapprove the policy as is. So at your board meeting, present the policy, no changes, please reapprove it. And make sure, another little tip is make sure you put the date that it's modified on the bottom. I like to put mine in a little footnote. So that way, right at the bottom, if you print it out or if you have, the digital file, you can see the date that it was amended. So not only having it in the spreadsheet, but also having it as a footnote, as a footer at the bottom of your document. Having the board reapprove it provides proof of the board's review and reaffirms the integrity of the policy. So if somebody decides to challenge one of your policies, you could say, well, no, this was approved by the board, such and such a date. The board is aware of it. The board is supporting that policy, and it really protects the library and it minimizes the risks.
Yeah, even for public perception, imagine defending a policy and it still says 2008 on there, right? So when the board, even if they don't change anything, reapproves it and it says 2020, that's a lot better than 2008.
Correct. Another thing that's recommended is that you create subcommittees of the board tasked to review and develop policies. So, maybe having a small core group of the board split off to, tackle, the internet use policy, have them reviewing policies. Okay, this year we're going to review these 3 policies, these 4 policies. So creating a subcommittee of the board to be able to do that. So it's a group of people that can work together and it doesn't all fall on the director of the library, or a library staff or whatever. It's NCLS circulation policy. So I mentioned earlier that some libraries tend to put their confidentiality of library records in their circulation policy. And right now we are trying to get libraries to consider adopting the NCLS circulation policy so that we can have some standardization amongst the libraries. We can have some uniformity. So please consider adopting our policy. It does have the confidentiality statement in there. So it's just a nice little template, and then you can fill it in with your library information, and pretty much the policy is written for you. So we're hoping that everybody will really consider taking a look at that and adopting that. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Matt, for training.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some training now. So of course, as we already previously mentioned, and as a lot of the trustees in the session will know, sexual harassment training is required, and that's every employer in New York State. And you have to do it annually, every single year. That's all library staff and essential volunteers, and of course, the trustees. Why we say essential volunteers is it's because you have to think about the liability that's involved. The volunteer is acting on behalf of the library, right? So it's essentially, there's liability, there's responsibility for that volunteer, right? If they're acting on behalf of the library. So you're going to want them to attend your sexual harassment training. I also want to mention too, that it is every employer in New York State. So your municipality has to do this. You might as well see when they're doing it and then try to get your group in there as well. If it's easier, a lot of our libraries do conduct the training themselves. NCLS conducts the training ourselves with a self-guided digital thing. So there's a lot of ways to complete the training, but just food for thought. Your municipality's got to do it anyway. So see if you can jump on with them. Also, now this is an NCLS requirement. CIRCE workflows. This is the ILS. This is the fancy software that library staff use to check books out with, right? So NCLS requires just a single training with that ILS software to be able to use it, right? Because we have to issue you specific credentials and everything. And I wanted to mention too that in April of 2023, we'll be moving to a different ILS. That would be Polaris, which you may have heard a little bit about so far. And when we get Polaris, that same requirement will still be there. Our library staff will have to have training with Polaris to be able to use the system, right? Okay, so we've got something required by New York State, something required by NCLS, and then this last one, as Dawn had already mentioned in the minimum standards, Standard 13 requires technology training for library staff. This is one of the new ones that just came on a couple years ago, but library staff have to have annual technology training appropriate to their position to address community needs as outlined in the library's long-range plan of service. Technology training, it could be you come to an NCLS website training. It could be if you've got 3D printers or virtual reality gear, It could be training with that. It could also just be a general session at NYLA or online that is highlighting, emerging technologies as well. So yeah, there's a lot that qualifies for this, but that is something that the board is responsible for making a priority, is this technology training for staff. Okay. The big one, and I know there's a lot of trustees who are either watching this now or will be watching this later. As you may have all heard at this point, starting in 2023, so January 1st of 2023, the calendar year of 23, library trustees are going to be required to complete 2 hours of education annually. In the law, eligible topics include basically anything related to being a trustee: financial oversight, accountability, fiduciary responsibilities, and the general powers and duties of being a library trustee. NCLS, NYLA, and NNYLN, that's the Northern New York Library Network up in, I guess it's technically Potsdam, but it's between Canton and Potsdam. We all provide Zoom, virtual and in-person trainings. There's a ton here that's eligible. Part of that law is that you do have to file the evidence of your training, just the certificate of completion or a self-signed assurance of completion, with your board president. Again, annually, 2 hours. This session would count, if it was in 2023, this session right here would count as an hour. If you go to the NYLA conference, that counts. Any of our virtual trainings that speak to these topics that were listed in the law here. Dawn?
I just wanted to mention, though, that if it is required by another state agencies, for example, sexual harassment training, it cannot be used towards your trustee training. So keep that in mind. So yes, anything else that we offer would fall in, but the sexual harassment training, I know a lot of them thought that would meet it. It does not. So just to keep that in mind.
And that is a really great point. And if you, a good test for that, again, too, if you think that sexual harassment would count, it does not apply to these duties as a library trustee, right? So you need 2 hours that specifically are, your duties as a trustee. Okay. And I'm gonna keep going with the website requirements now. Now, your library website, it provides information on library services as well as transparency of your governance. Since transparency is so important, both the DLD, that's again the Division of Library Development under New York State's Education Department, and New York State Open Meetings Law require your library to have certain items accessible from your website. This is one of the more important ones that we do. It's important because NCLS staff, DLD staff, and the community can all go to your website and see that you're not in compliance. That's why the website one is such an important one. So we'll start with the DLD minimum standards. Again, it's minimum standard 11 that says you need to provide information online that includes the standards referenced in minimum standards 1 through 5. Those are here. So if you've ever heard NCLS staff, or if you've seen it, you're recalling an email right now about how your website is supposed to have your bylaws, long-range plan, all your policies, budget on your website, that's where this requirement comes from. And again, you certify this on your annual report every year that you do have all of these things on your website. However, DLD could go to your website, and if you don't have them on there, they could just easily see. That's, again, why this is so important that you have these things on there. The beauty of a lot of these requirements, and especially this one, is they just have to be on there. They just have to be you can put them in a Google Drive. You can link them individually if you want to, but so long as they're on there in some fashion, accessible from your website, that works. Okay. So there's the minimum standard from the Division of Library Development. And then there's also New York State open meetings law that requires some very important things to be on your website. I would say that these are even more important than what I was just previously mentioning. Both important, both required, but these are extremely important. And these are the ones that your public, especially any contentious member of the public who, wants to, they might be angry at something else, and then they'll say, hey, I know a way I can stir up a little trouble. I'll go to the website and see if this public body is in compliance with open meetings law. So board meeting dates, those have to be posted on your website. Board meeting minutes have to be posted on your website within 2 weeks from the date of the meeting, and 1 week from the date if you hold an executive session. Okay. Now you're thinking, wait a second, those board meeting minutes would not have been approved by the board yet. You're going to want to put, this is technically optional. Get the minutes up there, and then you're going to want to put a little, thing that just says draft, right? Because it'll be the next meeting that those minutes get approved. Okay. There has been so many changes to New York State open meetings law over the past couple of years. This is one of them. You need to post to your library website required items that are subject of discussion by the board during an open meeting for a board meeting, 24 hours prior to the meeting where the items will be discussed. This sounds so much more complicated than it actually is. This is actually extremely easy to comply with. You just got to remember to upload it to your site. And again, if you put it in a, I'll let that ring. Yeah, you're just going to want to get them uploaded to your website. This is basically the board packet. No new documents have to be created to comply with this, right? Whatever the board is getting, whatever you emailed to the board in advance, just drop it on your website and you're good. Again, the documents that your board's going to be discussing, it's just the board packet. And again, no new documents have to be created. I do want to mention one other thing. In the actual law here, or actually there's a nice little Q&A about this law. It does also have the language to the extent practicable, okay? So let's say 6 hours before the meeting is the day of, an issue comes up and you go, oh crap, we got to talk about this thing tonight and we have a document, right? It's okay. It's totally fine. You can do that. And again, there's not enough time to get it up on your website and everything. And you can maybe even make a mention of that in the minutes, that a last minute thing came up and it was added to the agenda last minute. You're going to make any modifications to the agenda as well at the board meeting. So that'll get recorded in the minutes showing that this last minute thing came up, right? So just keep that in mind. But again, we have had a member of the public be upset that one of our libraries was not doing this. And again, this is all for transparency. The public has the right to show up to your meeting. Well, of course, they should have the right to also review those documents ahead of time, right? Any policy, if the board plans on approving a policy, I could go on and on about this specific new open meetings law requirement. But one thing that I want to mention too is that with NCLS, we upload our board packets online well in advance of the meeting, about a week in advance.
1 week, yes.
Yep. And that works out for our board because they know exactly every single time where they can go get those materials. We just link to it in an email. They can go see it all online. So this is actually better for the workflow of your board. It's just really easy.
Matt, it also speeds up your board meetings because they all have a chance to review the information before they come to the board meeting, where if you're giving it to them a day or two before, sometimes you're doing the review and looking at the materials at the board meeting. So having it put up there earlier not only meets the compliance, but it also helps to speed up your board meetings.
Great point. Great point. Obviously, this past spring, summer, there were big changes in video conferencing, right? You can no longer do the video conferencing as we knew it. You had to do there were some very specific hoops to jump through. If you still wanted a member or to video conference with a board approved eligible excuse, right? It's very complicated. I actually, for most of our boards, there are so many hoops to jump through, it's not necessarily feasible. However, if you are one of those libraries who did jump through all the hoops, one of those hoops is that you, well, you know, I've got here, please review the open meetings law guidance for video conferencing rules regarding your website, because you got to upload like the recording of the meeting and everything. And it's a bit much for most of our libraries to do. Okay. All right. So I'm going to have Dawn take over with this section now too. Oh, Dawn, I think you're muted again. Sorry.
Matt, I thought you were taking the 501c3.
Oh,
And
I'll
I
take
was,
it.
yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yep. So 501c3 and 990 reporting. So if your library has 501c3 status or your friends group has 501c3 status with the IRS, you have to file a 990 every year with the IRS. Okay. You got to file it by May 15th. I have unfortunately seen too many libraries and friends groups have their 501c3 status revoked because they went 3 consecutive years without filing a 990. It is so much work to try to get your 501c3 status back, right? So if your library's 501c3 status, it's just a reminder to have your 990 done. You can look up past 990 submissions for your library on the IRS website. Again, you'll be getting these slides in an email. Well, and the links will be on our nice little toolkit anyway. But if you're uncertain if your library or your friends group has tax exempt status, you can even search, right? Here's the thing about the friends group. I'm sure there's no friends in here. We're all friends, but I'm sure that there's only trustees in here and no friends proper uppercase. It is absolutely not the library's responsibility to have anything necessarily to do with the friends group's 501c3 status and their 990. However, if you are so, if you want to be helpful to your friends groups, you can remind them, because oftentimes it is the friends groups that lose their 990 versus the libraries, who sometimes still lose it. But it's the friends who, again, they just don't have the tight procedures for making sure that the 990 gets filed, and that's who loses it. So if you want to be a super helpful person and just double check, you're welcome to reach out to your friends, although it is not the library's responsibility.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
Oath of office. So when doing the annual report, one of the requirements on there is the oath of office, and it'll ask you the date the oath of office was taken and the date that it was filed. This is a requirement. All public library officers have to take and file their oath of office within 30 days of starting their term. So if you vote in January for new members of your board, they have 30 days to sign that oath of office and to file it with the local clerk. Okay, so it's not enough to just do it. You also have to file it if you are a public library officer. If you are an association library, it is not required. A lot of our association libraries still do it. It is still good practice to do it, but it is not a requirement on the annual report. So I just wanted to let you know it's not required, but it is good practice. And if if you're an association librarian, you do the oath of office and file them, please put that information on the annual report, even though it's not required for you. It is still good to have that information if you are doing the oaths. Okay. This includes partial terms and new consecutive terms too. And this is the biggest mistake I found during my time doing the annual reports is if Matt Corey was on the board and he resigned and I go on to fill part of his term, he ends early. A lot of people start a full term for me. They like, oh yeah, we'll start you today's date and we're going to give you the full 5-year term. But that's not the way it works. I'm serving a partial term. I'm going to complete the remainder of Matt Corey's term. And even though he took an oath of office, I have not. Even though I'm filling his term, I have not taken my oath. I haven't pledged, that I'm going to do all of this stuff. So you need to take an oath of office, even if it's a partial term. And the term will only extend for the remainder of Matt's term. Then I will start a new term. And even though I'm starting a new term and I'm still on the board, that oath of office ends the day that my term ends, and I have to take a new oath of office. Okay, so every time you're starting a new term, think of it as when your term expires, so does that oath of office. Okay, so keep that in mind. Tax cap reporting. For any libraries that receive tax funding from a ballot, whether it be that school ballot or a municipal ballot, if you receive tax funding, you have to complete the tax cap reporting form. Okay. Paulette is wonderful. She holds open meetings or open labs to help libraries with the tax cap reporting. So be looking for those because they are coming up. They're scheduled.
Yep. I'll throw that link in the chat here, and it's literally she's got like 3 tax
Three or
cap open
4
labs right at the November 17th, 21st, 2 on the 21st, November 22nd. Yeah. So
so if your library, is required to do that, if you are on receiving tax funding from a ballot and you have concerns about that, please come in for one of those open labs. That's a great opportunity, to get some one-on-one assistance. And Paulette knows the stuff inside and out. So, it's really a great resource. We know this might feel like a lot. Minimum standards are a lot. All of the requirements and compliance things that you have to keep track of are a lot. But please keep in mind that NCLS staff is here to help. We've got some resources. We've got some tools. So this year, we have the Compliance Initiative Toolkit that you guys are already familiar with, the paper form. So when you receive this form, I'll send it out in an email with a letter, and you're just going to go down through and you're going to check what you comply with. So you're going to read each thing, see if it applies to your library for the ones in red, and just going to check off if you're in compliance. That's it. It is not a requirement that you return it. If you want us to look at anything on your Compliance Initiative Toolkit, review, like for example, review your bylaws or anything like that, please feel free to send them in. If you want us to look over your whole Compliance Initiative Toolkit, please send it in, but it is not required this year like it was last year. This year, we have decided to offer a new interactive compliance toolkit. It will be a Google Sheet rather than paper format. And the thing I like about this is it allows for collaboration and comments. So if you did ask me to review your Compliance Initiative Toolkit and I had any kind, or to review your bylaws and I had any kind of recommendations or suggestions, I could put them right into this Google Sheet and you could access them on your time, anytime, anywhere, rather than doing a paper copy back and forth. It also allows us to do, on the spot collaboration. So we could both be on there and chatting back and forth, working on something. It saves the file automatically as you work too, which is a great feature for especially when, we get power outages or something happens and then you end up losing everything that you've done. So having it save automatically as you're working is great. And it maintains a history. Matt, can you click on the link so I can show them what it looks like?
Oh, Yeah, if you want to hit me with the access.
I thought I gave you access. Weren't we just looking at this yesterday? Okay. Let me go. I'm going to give you access right now. Yeah, I have you on there as access, Matt.
No, I don't know.
Well, that's not good.
Maybe I can even, let me see if I can find the,
I have you as an editor
okay.
because I shared
yeah,
it with you
let's see.
yesterday to do the,
Oh, interactive, here we go. Yep, boom.
okay.
Awesome. Yep.
All right. So the one thing that I really like about it is, can you hover over? Yes. So it'll show you yes or no. So on each one, you just choose yes or no, or if it's not applicable, it has an option for that on certain questions where it's not applicable. For comments, I can leave comments, and like library has range stated in the bylaws, it needs to add current voting positions 7. And also I can make recommendations like consider adding language to address your absences and consecutive terms. It also allows you to then write back to me. And we can have messages going back and forth, and it saves all of that history of those messages. So you can be like, oh, what did Dawn say to me on the phone about this? What was I supposed to do to the bylaws again? Now you have it written down somewhere that you can access, and it's all in one file. So you can see all of your compliance issues all in one place. So this is going to be an opt-in. I am not going to be sending this out to everybody. We will be doing the paper form unless you request the Google Sheet. If you would rather have the interactive Google Sheet, please let me know so that I can set you up for that. Also, I am really wanting to expand this and really wanting this compliance initiative toolkit to be something that works for our member libraries. So please, if you have recommendations, if there's things that you think you'd like to see on there, or even if you have constructive criticism of things that you think, you would like to see changed, please feel free to reach out to me or Matt or any of your consultants and let us know, what you're looking for on this, because we really want this to be, a toolkit and a guide, something that helps you in a resource, not something that, is creating, a lot more work for you. It's supposed to be here as a resource and to help you and guide you towards compliance.
Awesome.
So choose the toolkit that works best for you. Do you want paper format or interactive? And remember, seriously, NCLS staff are here to help. Reach out to us anytime. Does anybody have any questions or concerns?
Oh, look, Mark, looks like you've got one. Let's see.